The desert stretched outward in an endless hush, as though the earth itself had fallen asleep beneath a veil of pale starlight. The wind moved with a patient rhythm, carrying grains of sand like drifting embers across the barren expanse, each one a fragment of forgotten time. Here, under the vast dome of night, silence was never truly silence, for within it lay the faint murmur of stories long since buried. Those who wandered deep enough into the desert claimed they sometimes heard it, the almost imperceptible hum beneath their feet, as though the sand remembered voices, footsteps, and prayers that had once filled the air. This was Egypt's truest secret, not what had been written on temple walls, not what was carved into the stone of pyramids, but the unrecorded whispers that still clung to the desert itself. A cool breath of wind shifted across the dunes, bending them as if in slow motion, shaping new waves while erasing the old. The moon shone with silver light upon the pyramids in the distance, their black silhouettes rising like mountains sculpted by gods. They were not lifeless stones, but colossal keepers of memory, each block aligned with the weight of 1,000 hands and the intent of rulers who wished to touch eternity. Beneath their mass, the sands trembled with what could only be described as remembrance. Sometimes, it was said, the night wind carried fragments of chant, phrases in an ancient tongue that no living scholar had fully deciphered. The desert did not forget it, only buried. There had once been, so long ago that time itself hesitated to recall, a ritual performed in the dead of night. Not the grand festivals recorded by priests and sung before kings, but something quieter, meant only for the ears of the desert itself. A small group of robed figures would leave the safety of their villages, walking barefoot into the dunes where no walls and no firelight followed. They gathered in circles, their footprints erased almost as soon as they were made, and they whispered prayers not meant for men but for the earth. They believed that beneath the sands dwelt a force older even than the gods of temples, a force that listened but did not answer, a force that remembered and held in silence the truth of all ages. When the pyramids were built, some claimed it was not for the pharaohs alone, but also to seal this ancient presence in stone, binding it with rituals now lost. The desert itself was like a living archive, though not in the way papyrus scrolls or carved tablets preserved knowledge. Instead, it was an archive of silence. Each storm, each burial, each forgotten ruin became part of its memory. Even the air seemed heavier here, as though weighed down with the echoes of forgotten conversations. Travelers who slept beneath the stars swore they awoke to faint songs rising from nowhere, or to soft murmurs at their ears that faded when they opened their eyes. Sometimes the whispers sounded like water rushing underground, sometimes like the flutter of wings from birds long extinct. Most unsettling of all was when they resembled voices layered, countless, neither kind nor cruel, simply present, as if the desert itself breathed with the remnants of all who had crossed it. It was said that when the builders of the pyramids worked by night, they heard these voices too. Men lifting stones whispered among themselves that the earth beneath their feet was awake. Some carried charms around their necks not against death or misfortune, but against the overwhelming weight of that whisper, which threatened to drive them into madness if they listened too closely. The priests instructed them not to fear, explaining that the desert spoke because it was part of Ma'at, the balance between silence and sound, between what was known and what must forever remain hidden. But others believed the whispers were the remnants of a covenant far older than the dynasties themselves, a promise between men and the desert, unrecorded yet binding. Night after night, the dunes shifted imperceptibly, covering tombs, uncovering shards, erasing all traces of footprints until the desert looked untouched again. Yet, within that erasure, secrets grew heavier, compacted like layers of sand pressing down upon each other until they became stone. Beneath the soft surface lay entire worlds, forgotten graves, collapsed temples, fragments of bone, vessels of clay, and the outlines of rituals never meant to be disturbed. It was not difficult to imagine that every grain underfoot had once been witness to an empire's triumph or its sorrow. The desert was not always so barren. Long before the pyramids rose, before kings carved their names into history, the land was greener, watered by rains that fell from skies now dry. Herds of animals roamed where dunes now rest, and early tribes gathered in circles around fire and water. Those tribes, too, whispered their stories into the night. They spoke to stars, to unseen spirits, to the earth itself, asking for protection, for rain, for memory, and though their bodies were long gone, the echoes of their voices seemed woven into the desert wind. For those who walked slowly, who allowed themselves to listen rather than speak, it was possible to feel those ancient presences still moving alongside them. In the distance, the pyramids stood immovable, yet they too seemed to listen. Their angles caught moonlight, like great ears pointed toward the heavens. Each stone was placed with reverence, each passageway aligned with precision, not for human eyes alone, but to channel sound and silence together. Some claimed that deep within, beneath the burial chambers and false corridors, there were hidden spaces designed not for the dead, but for the whispers themselves to trap them, to preserve them, to ensure that the voices of the past would remain even as dynasties rose and fell. There were those who believed that at certain hours, when stars hung in exact positions over the pyramids, the whispers became clearer, as though amplified by the structure itself. Priests recorded the stars' movements obsessively, calculating moments when the veil between silence and sound was thinnest. On such nights, a procession would form, torches flickering in the dark as figures entered the pyramid's shadow. They did not bring music or drums, for these rituals were not meant for celebration. Instead, they moved silently, listening, waiting, hoping to catch fragments of the ancient murmur that the desert guarded so jealously. The common people never knew of these ceremonies. They saw pyramids as tombs, as signs of power, as mountains carved by divine order. But those who served in the innermost sanctuaries whispered otherwise. They told each other, in hushed tones, that the pyramids were more than resting places. They were vessels designed to hold something that could not otherwise be contained. Some described it as a memory, others as a presence, still others as an agreement between the world of men and something beneath the sand. Whatever it was, the priests feared it as much as they revered it, for in its whispers lay truths too vast for the human mind. Travelers who came across the desert centuries later, long after dynasties had crumbled, often spoke of feeling watched, though they saw nothing. Their camels halted at invisible boundaries, refusing to move forward until coaxed. Merchants swore that in the stillness of night they heard voices behind them, only to find the sands untouched. And yet, those who walked on felt an odd calm settle over them, as though the desert itself recognized them, catalogued them, added their presence to its eternal memory. In this way, every passerby became part of the whispers, their footsteps and breath absorbed into the chorus of silence. Tonight, the desert remained as it always had, vast, still, infinite in its patience. The pyramids rested against the horizon, silent yet alive with secrets too ancient to name. The stars above drifted slowly, their light falling upon stones that had seen countless generations pass. Beneath the dunes, the whispers endured, soft as the flutter of moth wings, yet heavy with the weight of forgotten ages. And if you listened closely, if you allowed the desert to speak in its slow, timeless voice, you could almost hear it, a lullaby of history, a chorus of the unseen, a reminder that nothing was ever truly lost, only hidden beneath the sand. The night faded gently, not with sudden brilliance, but with a patient surrender to the pale light of morning. The stars that had guarded the desert slowly dimmed, as though bowing out of sight, leaving the vast sky softened by the cool blush of dawn. The pyramids loomed in shadow against the horizon, their silhouettes shifting from black to grey, and then to gold as the sun's first rays touched their tips. The desert itself seemed to exhale, releasing the weight of night, welcoming the return of warmth. In this moment, when day was not yet full but darkness had already passed, Giza revealed itself in a way no other hour allowed. The pyramids did not simply stand, they glowed, as though awakened by the touch of light, as though the sun itself acknowledged them as companions in eternity. Long ago, when Egypt still trembled with the footsteps of pharaohs and priests, the coming of dawn was not simply the turning of time. It was a sacred event, bound to cycles of birth, death, and renewal. The people believed that the sun itself was a god Ra sailing across the heavens in a golden barque. Each morning was his victory over the darkness of night, and each evening his descent into the dangerous underworld, where serpents and shadows sought to devour him. The pyramids, massive as mountains yet sculpted by human hands, were not only tombs but also symbols of this daily struggle. They stood as earthly mirrors of the sun's eternal journey, their sharp points reaching upward to catch the first light, ensuring that Ra would never rise alone. As the first rays of sunlight slid down the limestone casing of the Great Pyramid, it was said that the entire structure once blazed like fire. The stones, polished to a dazzling brightness, reflected the light across the plateau, illuminating not only the pyramid itself, but also the land around it. Travelers approaching from afar claimed they could see the glow long before they arrived, mistaking it for the flame of a colossal torch guiding them through the desert. To the priests, this glow was not simply a trick of stone and sun, but the breath of divinity itself, proof that the pharaoh entombed within was united with the solar god. In those first moments of dawn, the line between heaven and earth seemed to blur, and the desert became a stage where gods and men shared the same light. The workers who had once toiled on these monuments would stop in reverence at sunrise, their labor briefly forgotten. Some knelt in the sand, whispering thanks for another day of breath, another chance to serve in the shadow of eternity. Others simply watched, their eyes wide with awe, feeling for a moment that their sweat and blood had built something more than stone, that they had shaped a bridge between earth and sky. Even after centuries, long after the kings who commanded such feats had turned to dust, the memory of this awe clung to the desert. The air at dawn carried it still, like a fragrance too subtle to name but impossible to ignore. The priests, keepers of ritual and knowledge, performed their secret ceremonies at this sacred hour. Clad in linen robes, they stood before altars aligned to the east, their arms lifted to the horizon. They recited hymns inscribed on papyrus scrolls and carved into temple walls, songs that praised the sun's rebirth, songs that called upon the hidden forces of Ma'at, order, balance, and harmony. The rising sun was not merely light, it was a reminder that chaos had been defeated once again, that life was permitted to continue. The pyramids themselves, aligned so precisely with the cardinal directions, acted as silent witnesses to these prayers, as though recording the devotion in their silent stone. And yet, beneath the grandeur of ritual and the brilliance of stone, there were whispers of something more, something that the priests did not speak of openly. It was believed by some that the pyramids themselves contained hidden chambers, where the first light of dawn entered only on certain days of the year. Within those secret spaces, shafts of sunlight illuminated carvings not meant for ordinary eyes. Symbols of serpents, stars, and strange gods appeared in gold light, only for a few breaths before sinking again into darkness. What these carvings meant, no one dared to say, for they hinted at knowledge beyond the cycles of sun and night, beyond the official worship of Ra. They hinted at a pact older than any dynasty, a pact between the desert and those who dared build upon it. The people of the villages near Giza rose with the sun, their daily lives intertwined with the rituals of light. Farmers led their cattle to graze where the Nile's waters kissed the earth, while women ground grain into flour and prepared offerings for household shrines. Children chased each other through narrow streets, their laughter echoing against mud-brick walls. Yet even in the ordinary rhythm of life, the pyramids loomed, their presence a reminder that nothing was ordinary in Egypt. To wake each morning in their shadow was to live in constant conversation with eternity. Even those who could not read the inscriptions, who knew little of astronomy or sacred texts, felt that they were participants in something larger than themselves, woven into a story that stretched far beyond the reach of human years. At dawn, merchants prepared to travel with their goods, their camels and donkeys laden with baskets of barley, jars of oil, and bolts of linen. They too paused, watching the sunlight crown the pyramids, as though seeking reassurance that the gods favored their journey. Soldiers stationed nearby sharpened their weapons in the growing light, whispering quiet prayers for protection. The desert itself, once cold, now warmed beneath the golden glow, its sands glittering as though dusted with jewels. The land awoke in unison, from pharaoh to farmer, from scribe to shepherd, each one touched by the same Sunday. The first dawn over Giza was not only a moment of beauty, but also of mystery. For though the pyramids revealed themselves in the light, they also concealed their secrets more deeply. Shadows slipped down their sides as the sun climbed higher, covering the entrances and false corridors designed to mislead intruders. Beneath the visible grandeur, the hidden world of chambers and rituals remained untouched, waiting for those who dared to descend into silence. The desert gave light but also took it away, keeping its whispers safe in darkness. As the day grew brighter, the brilliance of the dawn softened into the ordinary heat of Sunday. The pyramids no longer blazed like fire, but stood steady, massive, immutable. Yet those who had witnessed the first rays knew they had seen something sacred, something eternal. For in that brief moment, when the sun's golden breath touched the pyramids, time itself had seemed to pause, and the whispers of the desert had risen to meet the light. And though the day would move forward, though the sands would shift and lives would end, the memory of dawn lingered, eternal as the stone itself, waiting to be born again with every sunrise. The desert might have seemed eternal in its silence, but without the Nile there would have been no Egypt, no pyramids rising against the horizon, no cities of stone and faith enduring the test of centuries. The river was not merely water, it was the breath of life itself, flowing ceaselessly from distant, unseen lands, in the south to the wide embrace of the Mediterranean. To those who lived upon its banks, it was both mother and god, a shifting boundary between fertility and death. Every stalk of grain, every loaf of bread, every vessel of beer traced its origin to this steady, sacred current. And in the cool hush of dawn, when the desert sand still remembered the whispers of night, the Nile shimmered like a ribbon of liquid gold, carrying secrets as old as the earth itself. It was said that the river was a gift from the god Hapi, lord of the inundation, whose blue skin and garlands of reeds represented the abundance of the floods. Each year, the Nile swelled beyond its banks, spilling into fields, covering them in a blanket of dark, fertile silt. This rhythm was no accident, it was the divine heartbeat of the land, a promise renewed with every season. The farmers who bent their backs in the soil did not merely work the earth, they participated in a ritual as ancient as creation itself. To them, planting seeds was an act of faith, an offering of trust to the river that it would rise again and grant life. And when the waters retreated, leaving behind fertile plains ready for harvest, the people sang hymns to Hapi, thanking him for the miracle of survival. But the Nile was more than agriculture, more than the cycle of planting and reaping. It was the sacred thread that bound heaven, earth, and the underworld together. Boats of reed and later of carved wood floated along its current, carrying not only goods and passengers but also the bodies of kings and nobles to their resting places. The Egyptians believed that just as the river flowed from one end of the land to another, so too did the soul travel from this life into the next. Death was not an ending, but a crossing, a voyage upon the river of eternity. For this reason, tombs were often aligned to its banks, their entrances facing west, where the sun sank each evening into darkness. The west was the realm of the dead, yet even in death, the river promised passage, carrying the soul gently toward eternity. In the great cities along the Nile, temples rose with pillars like forests of stone, their walls alive with painted scenes of gods, offerings, and festivals. The priests who tended these temples drew their power not only from the pharaoh's favor but from the river itself. For every ritual required water, every libation a sip of the Nile poured before the feet of statues. In secret chambers, priests collected jars of this sacred water, using it to cleanse, to anoint, to awaken divine statues from their silence. They believed that the Nile carried not just water but also fragments of divine essence, flowing from the hidden springs of creation itself. To pour it was to give life, to drink it was to be renewed, to bathe in it was to step momentarily into the presence of the gods. And yet, beneath these sacred rituals and public ceremonies, there lay other stories, stranger and quieter, told in whispers among fishermen and villagers. Some said that beneath the Nile's surface flowed a second river, invisible to the eye but real to those who dreamed. This hidden current was said to carry the memories of all who had died, their voices moving endlessly through the water. Those who leaned too close to the banks at night claimed to hear it, faint echoes rising from beneath the surface, like a chorus of the departed. The priests never confirmed this tale, yet nor did they deny it. for perhaps in silence there was acknowledgement of truths too dangerous for common ears. It was also said that certain temples along the Nile hid chambers where underground canals connected directly to the river. In these secret places, water was drawn not for rituals of cleansing, but for ceremonies never written in public texts. Initiates were submerged in darkness, their mouths filled with sacred water, their lungs burning until they emerged reborn, gasping as though entering the world anew. To the few who survived such rites, the river was no longer simply water but a living god, a deity who had entered their very breath. Many never spoke of what they saw beneath the water, yet their eyes shone differently, as though touched by eternity. The river was also a road of commerce and conquest. Long boats laden with grain, wine, papyrus, and stone travelled its current, their sails catching the steady wind. Soldiers, too, marched along its banks, their banners mirrored in the water, their footsteps heavy with the promise of both protection and war. And yet, no matter how powerful the armies, no matter how vast the fleets, the river remained beyond control. It gave life when it chose and withheld it when angered. In years when the flood failed, famine spread like a shadow across the land. Whole villages starved, their fields cracked and dry, their granaries empty. The people prayed louder, offered more, but the Nile kept its silence. Such years reminded all, even pharaohs, that no one ruled the river, and that Egypt itself lived only at its mercy. Travelers from foreign lands marveled at this bond between people and river. To them, water was water, a resource to be used. But to Egyptians, every ripple of the Nile was sacred, every flood a blessing, every drought a test. Even the smallest child knew songs praising its waters, songs that compared its floods to the milk of a divine mother, nourishing the land. Artists carved scenes of lotus flowers blooming upon its surface, symbols of rebirth rising from the mud. Poets likened it to a vein of eternity running through the earth, carrying with it the very essence of creation. And in truth, the Nile was not merely a feature of geography, it was the axis upon which Egypt's very soul turned. At twilight, when the sun dipped low and the waters shimmered with crimson light, fishermen cast their nets into the river, their bodies swaying with the current. Children splashed along the edges, their laughter mingling with the cry of ibis and heron. Women bent over jars, drawing water for their homes, while the faint smoke of cooking fires drifted upward. All of this was life, simple and ordinary, yet bound to something vast and eternal. For when night fell and the desert whispered again, the Nile whispered too, its waters dark, its secrets hidden, carrying onward through the silence. It had seen dynasties rise and fall, kings crowned and buried, cities born and consumed by sand, yet still it flowed, unchanged, eternal, the river of life and death alike. And so the Nile remained, a ribbon of eternity, winding through the desert's heart, sustaining, remembering, and concealing. Its waters fed the soil, its floods measured the years, its current carried the living and the dead alike. Every Egyptian, from pharaoh to farmer, lived in its shadow and trusted in its return. And though its surface sparkled with sunlight by day and moonlight by night, beneath its depths lay mysteries too vast to ever be spoken aloud. For the Nile was not merely a river, it was the voice of time itself, flowing without end, carrying Egypt forever upon its back. The walls of Egypt did not merely enclose, they spoke. Every column, every lintel, every slab of stone carved within temples and tombs seemed to hum with meaning, its surface alive with figures and signs that told stories as vast as the desert and as intimate as a single prayer. Hieroglyphs, the sacred script of the Nile, were not words alone but living symbols, each stroke of the chisel an invocation. To gaze upon them in the flickering light of a torch was to feel oneself standing at the threshold of mystery, as if the walls themselves were whispering directly to the heart of whoever dared to listen. The Egyptians called this language MDW, Enter, the words of the gods, for they believed writing had not been invented by men but gifted by Thoth, the ibis-headed lord of wisdom. To inscribe was to breathe fragments of eternity into stone. Each symbol carried more than sound, it carried essence. A bird carved upon a wall was not merely a drawing but, in some measure, the bird itself, tied to the spirit of the real creature. A serpent carved in a tomb could carry protection or danger, depending on the ritual surrounding it. To chisel the wrong sign, to misplace a stroke, was to summon forces unintended, for this was not simply language, it was creation itself. Within the pyramids and hidden chambers of temples, walls stretched upward, crowded with thousands of signs, their colors vibrant when new, their meanings layered like the folds of eternity. Some lines spoke directly to the gods, prayers asking for sustenance, for light, for safe passage into the afterlife. Others were spells of protection, meant to repel serpents, demons, or the chaos that always threatened order. And still others were mapped celestial diagrams showing the paths of stars, the courses of planets, the cycle of Ra's bark as it sailed through the sky. Each inscription was both text and talisman, an unbroken thread tying the living and the dead, the seen and the unseen. For those who could read, the walls became alive. Imagine a priest walking slowly through a burial chamber, the flame of his oil lamp casting gold across the hieroglyphs. The birds seemed to flutter in the shifting light. The jackals seemed to stalk along the stone. The flowing lines of water rippled as if moved by unseen currents. The chamber was not silent, it murmured, with chants, with hymns, with instructions left for the soul of the pharaoh. The reader was less interpreter than participant, for to speak the words aloud was to awaken them, to set them moving once again through time. To remain illiterate in this sacred tongue was to walk blind through eternity. To master it was to wield a power that bent silence into speech. And yet, among the countless inscriptions that adorned Egypt's monuments, there were some that troubled even the most learned priests. Symbols that appeared rarely, carved in obscure corners, half hidden in shafts where light seldom reached. Figures that seemed older than the temples in which they appeared. Spirals, stars, animals with forms unfamiliar, even to those who knew every god. Some whispered that these were remnants of a language older than dynasties, older even than memory itself. Not all inscriptions were meant for human eyes. Some were carved to speak only to the desert, or to the gods beneath it. To linger too long upon such symbols was to invite dreams that did not fade at dawn, dreams filled with voices speaking in tongues no living priest could translate. Scholars of the royal court, men tasked with preserving the knowledge of their age, sometimes debated in hushed voices whether these forgotten signs recorded things better left unsaid. Was there an older covenant, older than Ra's journey, older than Osiris's throne, that had been sealed in carvings too obscure for the masses? If so, why had the priests preserved them in shadows rather than erasing them? Perhaps they feared that to destroy the words would be to destroy balance itself, for what was written was believed to live. Erasure was death, and death had consequences not even kings could command. In tombs of nobles, hieroglyphs spread across the walls like protective nets. They showed the soul how to speak the names of gods when challenged, how to cross rivers of fire, how to avoid the jaws of monsters in the underworld. These words were not for beauty alone. They were tools of survival, weapons forged from speech. A single line of inscription could guard the soul more fiercely than bronze, could repel spirits of chaos more surely than armies. The hieroglyphs were a fortress of meaning, their walls invisible yet impenetrable, surrounding the pharaoh's spirit for eternity. Even outside the great tombs, the language adorned stelae, statues, and boundary markers. Travelers stopping at a roadside shrine could trace the lines of a prayer with their fingers, murmuring the words as though summoning unseen guardians to accompany them. Farmers carved protective signs upon the walls of their homes, believing the language itself could repel disease and misfortune. For them, writing was not merely for record but for communion, a way of asking the gods to notice, to intervene, to care. Yet perhaps the greatest mystery of the hidden language of stone lay in its silence, for as much as it revealed, it concealed even more. The same signs that told of Ra's journey could also align with stars in the night sky, creating maps of cosmic order. A prayer for grain might also carry an astronomical truth, a warning of floods, or an omen of drought. Every line was layered, one meaning folded within another, visible only to those initiated into the deepest mysteries. To the common eye, a falcon was simply Horus. To the trained, it was also the morning star, the rebirth of the sun, the promise of the king's eternal gaze. To the chosen few, it was something even greater, something unspeakable. When dawn broke over Giza, sunlight poured into corridors of stone, catching upon carved walls, bringing the symbols briefly to life. Birds glowed with golden wings, serpents glimmered, and stars sparkled where chisel marks caught the light. The language of stone did not sleep, but it waited for the touch of light or the sound of voice to stir again. And so the desert, which whispered at night with its unseen voices, now spoke in daylight through walls of stone, through signs as eternal as the pyramids themselves. For Egypt's greatest secret was not only its monuments of stone, but the words inscribed upon them, the language that bound eternity to the earth, that gave voice to silence, that carried forward secrets too ancient for time to erase. The desert is a master of concealment. It swallows whole cities, silences rivers that once sang with life, and buries temples so deeply that their names fade from memory. Among its greatest acts of erasure was a shrine once dedicated to a goddess whose identity slipped between the pages of official history, a deity whispered about in half-remembered stories, invoked not in daylight but in the secrecy of night. She was not written in the king's monuments, nor did she appear in the hymns of the great temples of Karnak or Luxor. Yet beneath drifting dunes lay her sanctuary, its stones worn smooth by centuries of sand, its walls faintly carved with signs that resisted the desert's patient erasure. Here, the forgotten goddess lingered, hidden from the gaze of both the living and the gods enthroned in the empire's grand pantheon. Once, the temple had stood near the edge of the floodplain, where the Nile's waters reached out in silver veins into the desert. Travelers coming along the river would have glimpsed its pillars rising, modest compared to the colossal temples of Amun or Ra, but dignified, adorned with images of lotuses, serpents, and crescent moons. At dusk, when the horizon glowed crimson, its facade shimmered as if alive, bathed in the interplay of firelight and shadow. It was here, in the threshold between fertile soil and shifting sands, that the goddess was said to dwell, not a ruler of the skies or the underworld, but of liminal spaces, of things half seen, half forgotten, half dreamed. Her name was spoken softly, never carved openly upon stelae, never proclaimed in public prayers. Some believed she was once a consort of Thoth, keeper of hidden wisdom, her role to guard secrets too perilous for humankind. Others said she was born from the desert winds themselves, an embodiment of silence and concealment, sister to the night and mother to memory. Her statues, rare and delicate, showed a figure with wide eyes painted in lapis, a serpent coiled about her arms, and in her hand a single lotus flower, closed tight as if to withhold its meaning. Worshippers described her as neither benevolent nor wrathful, but watchful, always present, always listening. By day, the temple lay quiet, its doors closed, its courtyards empty. But when the moon climbed above the dunes, worshippers came silently, cloaked in linen, their footsteps muffled by sand. They brought no trumpets or drums, for her rites demanded stillness. Offerings were small, a bowl of milk, a garland of reeds, a handful of black coal. They placed them upon stone altars and whispered prayers that vanished into the wind. The rituals were not for protection from enemies or for abundance of harvest, but for remembrance, for keeping alive the parts of existence that the greater gods ignored. Women who had lost children, men who carried unspoken guilt, scribes burdened with forbidden knowledge, these were her devotees. She was the guardian of what was hidden, of grief unshared, of truths too dangerous for the Sunday. The temple itself seemed designed to preserve this secrecy. Its inner chambers were narrow and winding, with ceilings so low that even priests had to stoop. The walls were carved with strange figures, half-formed animals, spirals, and stars, arranged not in the familiar constellations, but in patterns no astronomer could explain. In the innermost sanctuary, a pool of water lay still, reflecting torchlight like a mirror. Pilgrims believed that if they gazed long enough into the pool, the goddess might reveal what was lost to them, a memory of the dead, a forgotten face, a truth buried by time. Many emerged from the chamber with eyes wet, trembling as though touched by something too vast to name. For centuries, the temple survived in shadow, visited only by those who sought her secret presence. But empires change, Gods rise and fall, and pharaohs, fearful of losing authority, decreed that her name should vanish. Official decrees condemned her worship, statues were defaced, inscriptions hammered away. Priests of other temples whispered that she was a dangerous spirit, an enemy of Ra, a corrupter of balance. The people grew afraid, and slowly her followers dwindled. The temple was left untended, its pillars crumbling, its sanctuaries filling with sand. And yet, those who remembered her never truly ceased their devotion. In hidden corners of villages, mothers still traced her symbol upon amulets of clay. Fishermen muttered her name beneath their breath before casting nets, and travelers invoked her silence when crossing dangerous deserts. Time, however, is relentless. Centuries passed, dynasties fell, and the temple was swallowed entirely by the desert, reduced to a faint rise beneath the dunes. Only fragments remained, a broken statue here, a shard of painted pottery there, discovered by wandering shepherds or exposed briefly by storms before vanishing again beneath the sand. Scholars of later ages puzzled over these fragments, noting that the symbols did not align with the official pantheon. They speculated about foreign influence, about forgotten cults, about gods erased deliberately from the record. Yet the people who lived closest to the desert needed no explanation. They said simply, "She is still there." Even now, when the moon is high and the desert wind shifts, travelers claim that the dunes near Giza sometimes hum with an unfamiliar stillness. Those who sleep too near awake with dreams of eyes glowing in the dark, of whispers rising from unseen lips, of serpents sliding across the sand without sound. Some wake with tears upon their cheeks, though they cannot recall why. Others return with fragments of song upon their tongues, lullabies they never learned yet somehow know. The temple may be gone, but the goddess lingers, her presence woven into the very breath of the desert, her whispers carried endlessly by the sands. The pyramids may dominate the horizon, colossal and unyielding, but they do not stand alone. Beneath their shadow, half-forgotten sanctuaries like hers tell quieter stories, stories of gods not triumphant but hidden, not celebrated but mourned, not recorded but remembered in silence. And in those stories lies a truth more haunting than any inscription carved in stone, that memory itself has a guardian, and that nothing, once whispered to the desert, is ever truly lost. Across the plateau, where the pyramids carved sharp silhouettes against the endless sky, stood figures that did not move yet, seemed always to be watching. They were statues, colossal forms of stone and lion shapes, sphinxes crouching with eternal patience, guardians of temples and tombs. To the eye of a passerby they were monuments, inert and immobile. Yet to those who lingered beneath their gaze, there was something unsettling, an impression that the guardians were not merely carved but alive, in ways that defied time. Their silence was not emptiness, but a presence, a vow unbroken through centuries, to see, to listen, and to speak only to the desert. The Egyptians understood that stone itself could breathe eternity. They chose granite and limestone not only for their strength, but because they believed such matter was capable of holding spirit. When sculptors struck their chisels into blocks of rock, they were not creating likenesses, they were opening vessels. A statue of a lion was not a symbol of strength, it was strength. A statue of a god was not representation, it was presence. The moment the final rituals were performed, the moment incense and offerings awakened the carved form, the statue no longer belonged to man, it became guardian, witness, participant in the eternal drama of balance between chaos and order. The most famous of these watchers was the great Sphinx of Giza, its body long and low like a crouched beast, its face bearing the likeness of a forgotten king. Even now, worn by storms, its nose broken, its body scarred by sand, it gazes eastward as though awaiting the return of dawn. Legend held that it had once spoken, its deep voice rolling like thunder across the plateau. Some said it revealed prophecies to kings, promising long reigns or warning of rebellion. Others believed its silence was its true gift, for in refusing to speak it absorbed every word ever uttered before it, storing them within its stone heart, keeping memory safe where no human ear could trespass. Lesser sphinxes lined processional roads leading to temples, their eyes fixed forward, their paws pressed firmly into the earth. Pilgrims passed between them in hushed awe, their footsteps echoing against the silent stone. To walk such a road was to feel oneself measured, judged not by priests, but by the immovable gaze of the guardians. Some felt comforted, believing the statues shielded them from harm, their stillness a wall against spirits of chaos. Others trembled, sensing their secrets laid bare, their unspoken sins read by eyes that had never closed. The guardians were not all lions. Some took the form of falcons, with wings folded tight, others jackals crouched as though mid-hunt, others human figures with eyes wide and lips pressed into silence. Each bore the weight of centuries, their forms eroded by wind, yet never diminished. In the hush of night, when the desert whispered beneath the stars, they seemed to breathe with the earth itself. Travelers camping nearby sometimes claimed to hear a low hum, a resonance that vibrated in the bones rather than the ears. Whether it was the wind moving through ancient cracks or the voices of the guardians themselves, none could say. Priests of old performed rituals at their feet, pouring libations of milk and honey, anointing the stone with fragrant oils. They recited hymns that spoke not to men, but directly to the guardians, reminding them of their eternal vow to watch, to protect, to preserve the silence of Egypt's deepest secrets. For the statues were not simply guardians of tombs, but of memory itself. In their stillness, they carried the weight of forgotten ages, their silence more profound than any library, their presence more enduring than any scroll. There were stories, whispered in the markets, and carried by boatmen along the Nile, that certain statues could move but not as men or beasts move. Instead, they shifted imperceptibly, their gazes changing from one horizon to another, their shadows falling where they had not fallen before. Such tales were dismissed by the scribes, who called them foolish imaginings. Yet even they admitted that the guardians seemed always to know more than they revealed. A farmer passing a crumbled lion statue might swear its eyes followed him, its mouth quivering as though on the edge of speech. A soldier stationed near the sphinxes of Thebes might dream of them walking at night, their paws leaving no tracks, their silence unbroken as they patrolled the temple walls. Silence itself was their gift. In a world alive with hymns, chants, and endless recitations, the guardians offered something deeper, the weight of stillness. To stand before them was to feel oneself stripped of noise, of pretense, of the endless clamoring of the human mind. They reflected nothing and everything, mirrors not of light, but of soul. Those who dared to kneel in their presence sometimes rose changed, their fears quieted, their desires muted. It was as though the guardians, in their eternal patience, had absorbed the chaos within and returned only calm. But silence is not always comfort. For some, the guardians' stillness was unbearable, their gaze a reminder of mortality, their refusal to speak a torment to those desperate for answers. There are tales of men who begged the Sphinx for prophecy, shouting their questions into its stone face until their voices broke. None received reply. Yet those same men often vanished into the desert soon after, their names erased, their footsteps lost. The guardians did not give answers, they kept them. As centuries passed, sand climbed the bodies of statues, swallowing them up to their necks, hiding their paws and wings, leaving only their faces visible above the dunes. Yet even half buried, their silence endured, and when storms uncovered them centuries later, they gazed upon the world unchanged, as though no time had passed at all. Kings rose and fell, empires blossomed and crumbled, but the guardians remained, their stillness unbroken, their vow intact. To stand beneath their gaze even now is to feel the breath of ages. The desert hums, the pyramids loom, the Nile flows, but the statues wait. They do not speak, they do not move, yet their silence weighs heavier than sound, their patience longer than memory. They are the watchers of Egypt, the keepers of its secrets, the guardians of silence who never close their eyes. And in their stillness lies the most haunting truth of all, that eternity does not shout, it listens. Beneath the colossal stones of the pyramids, where sunlight could not reach and the desert's breath grew still, there lay chambers so narrow and hidden that only the most trusted priests ever entered. These were not the grand halls where festivals were celebrated, nor the painted tombs that noble families displayed with pride. These were places of shadow, places of ritual, where silence was bound tighter than stone itself. To speak of what happened within these corridors was forbidden. To remember it too clearly was dangerous. And yet, through fragments whispered from age to age, through half-buried papyri and faded tales among the common people, the veil of sacred rites can be glimpsed, thin but persistent, fluttering like a torch flame in the dark. The rituals were never performed in daylight. They belonged to the hours when stars cast pale reflections upon the desert and the moon bent low across the horizon. Priests would move in procession toward the pyramid, their linen garments rustling softly, their faces painted with kohl to shield against unseen forces. Torches were not always carried. Often they walked by memory alone, for the rites demanded secrecy and humility. At the threshold of hidden passages, chants began low at first, little more than a hum, then rising into waves that echoed through the stone like a heartbeat. These were not the hymns sung in public temples, praising Ra's ascent or Osiris's judgment. These chants were older, their words drawn from tongues no longer spoken, syllables that felt more like vibrations than speech, designed not for men, but for the unseen ears of eternity. Inside the pyramid, the air grew heavy. Corridors narrowed, walls pressed close, and shadows deepened into black. The priests carried sacred objects, jars of oil, carved figurines of gods unknown to common worship, knives of flint that gleamed faintly in the dark. They moved in careful order, each step measured, for it was believed that the very stones were listening. To stumble, to falter, to misplace a word in the chant was to offend forces beyond the reach of even pharaohs. And so they moved slowly, each breath synchronized with ritual, each gesture echoing thousands of years of repetition. At the heart of these ceremonies was the belief that the pyramid was not only a tomb but a bridge between worlds. The burial chamber of the king was more than a resting place. It was a chamber of transformation. Through rites performed in silence, the soul of the pharaoh was guided beyond death, stripped of mortal weight, and remade as an eternal companion of the gods. The priests, acting as guides, enacted scenes of creation and destruction, speaking words that opened gates no human eye could see. Their chants called upon the four winds, upon the stars of the north, upon the waters of the primordial abyss. The pyramid became a theatre, its unseen audience not men but deities, spirits, and the very desert itself. There were moments in these rites when silence was absolute. The chants would cease, the torches extinguished, and the priests stood in darkness, their palms pressed to the cold stone. It was believed that in this silence the soul of the pharaoh could hear the whispers of the desert beneath, guiding him toward the path of eternity. For what the world outside called whispers were, to the priests, the very voices of those who had passed before an eternal chorus carrying instructions for crossing into the next world. Only when the silence was broken again by the measured sound of ritual drums or the hiss of burning incense did the priests move forward. Certain rites involved the offering of blood, not of men, for such practices belonged to foreign cults, but of animals chosen with precision. Black bulls, symbolizing strength, white birds, symbolizing purity, serpents, embodying the eternal cycle of death and rebirth. Their sacrifice was swift, their blood collected in bowls of alabaster. It was not spilled upon the ground, but carefully poured along carved channels that ran into hidden basins within the chamber. The priests did not call this sacrifice, but exchange. Life given for life, voice given for silence, a covenant renewed between the living and the eternal. At the height of the ritual, the body of the pharaoh, already embalmed and prepared with oils and resins, was brought into the chamber. He was laid upon a stone slab carved with stars and lines aligned to constellations above. The golden mask that covered his face gleamed faintly in the darkness, reflecting torchlight like a sun buried beneath the earth. Around him, priests moved in patterns, raising their hands, whispering prayers, not meant to be heard by men but absorbed by the stone itself. They touched the mask, the chest, the limbs, tracing symbols of protection with fingers dipped in oil. They called upon Isis, upon Osiris, upon gods of the night sky, but also upon names unspoken outside these walls, names that had no temples, no festivals, only presence. The most secret of these rites was the opening of the mouth, a ceremony in which the senses of the pharaoh were restored for eternity. With tools of copper and flint, the priests touched his lips, his eyes, his ears, his nostrils, speaking words that commanded them to awaken. It was believed that through this act, the king could eat and drink in the afterlife, could see the stars, could hear the prayers of the living. But among the initiated, there was also a darker truth, that in those moments, the veil between the living and the dead thinned, and the soul of the pharaoh might stir. Some priests swore they felt his breath upon their faces, faint and cold as desert wind, or heard a whisper escape from behind the golden mask. Whether this was imagination or truth, none dared say aloud. The rites continued long into the night, each act building upon the last, until the chamber itself seemed to tremble with the weight of unseen presences. Finally, the body was sealed within its sarcophagus, layers of stone drawn over it, corridors blocked with rubble, traps set to deter intruders. The chants dwindled, the torches died, and the priests withdrew in silence, leaving the pharaoh alone with eternity. Yet the rites did not end there. Outside, beneath the stars, offerings were left upon altars, loaves of bread, jars of wine, bowls of honey, meant to nourish the spirit in its journey. And in the days that followed, more rituals continued, for death was not an instant but a passage, a slow unbinding of the soul from its earthly bonds. To the people who labored outside, these ceremonies were mysteries. They saw the pyramids rise, saw kings buried, but they did not know what shadows unfolded within the stone. And yet, they sensed it, for on certain nights, when the wind shifted and the stars hung low, a strange hum could be heard drifting from the direction of the pyramid, as though the stones themselves were still chanting. Families drew their children close, whispering prayers against spirits. Yet deep inside, they knew the sound was not of danger, but of eternity. Thus the veil of sacred rites remained intact, thin, trembling, but never lifted. The pyramids stood as monuments to kings, yet within them were chambers where silence itself had been bound into ritual. Every block of stone, every hidden corridor, carried the memory of chants spoken in voices long gone, of incense burned to ash, of offerings consumed by time. And though no priest remains to speak them, the desert remembers, the pyramids remember, and the whispers of the night carry fragments still, like echoes of a song that can never entirely fade. Beneath the towering mass of the pyramid, far below the sunlit stones that dazzled at dawn, and the grand corridors meant for ceremonial procession, there existed chambers that were spoken of only in whispers. These were not the rooms marked upon maps or carved into temple reliefs for all to see, but concealed sanctuaries, sealed away by cunning masons and guarded by silence. They were built not for the eyes of courtiers, nor for the ritual processions of priests, but for the pharaoh alone, a secret resting place where his body and spirit were bound to eternity. The hidden chamber, as it came to be remembered, was less a tomb than a vessel, a space that fused heaven and earth into stone and shadow. The entrance to such a chamber was never direct. Architects and priests, sworn to secrecy, devised elaborate networks of false passages and dead ends, designed to mislead grave robbers and the uninitiated. Some corridors descended sharply before ending in walls of unyielding rock, while others twisted in confusing patterns, their ceilings pressed low to force intruders into submission. The real chamber lay beyond these tricks, its approach concealed by rubble deliberately piled and sealed, its threshold hidden behind slabs so perfectly fitted that centuries of shifting sand could not expose them. Only those who had walked the rituals, who had carried the chants within their hearts, knew how to reach its door. And when that door finally opened, when torches were raised and their flickering light revealed the chamber within, what lay beyond seemed less the work of men than of gods. The walls were carved with constellations, their stars inlaid with fragments of precious stone, so that they glimmered like the heavens themselves. Lapis lazuli formed rivers of blue across the ceiling, while gold leaf shimmered like rays of an eternal Sunday. Figures of gods, Isis, Osiris, Horus, Thoth, spread their wings across the stone, their eyes inlaid with obsidian, their forms alive in the wavering light. Every surface was an invocation, every carving a passage into eternity. At the center stood the sarcophagus, a massive block of granite carved with both care and ferocity, its lid heavy enough to require dozens of men to set in place. Upon its surface were etched prayers and spells, each line aligned with precision to the stars overhead. The sarcophagus was more than a coffin. It was a map, a guide that directed the soul toward rebirth among the constellations. The pharaoh within was not merely king of Egypt, but companion of Ra, destined to rise with the sun each morning and sail across the heavens for all eternity. To open such a chamber was to step into a theater of cosmic drama, where stone, light, and silence merged into something that felt alive. Around the sarcophagus lay objects of wonder, offerings chosen with care, not only for their value, but for their symbolism. Golden vessels shaped like lotus blossoms held unguents of cedar and myrrh. Carved alabaster jars contained organs preserved for eternity, each guarded by the heads of the 4 sons of Horus. Statues of falcons and jackals stood in rows, their eyes watchful, their mouths closed in silence. There were boats carved from wood and gilded with gold, miniature vessels meant to carry the pharaoh's soul along the celestial river. There were weapons, 2 daggers with hilts of ivory, bows strung with sinew meant to protect against unseen enemies in the realm beyond. And scattered among these treasures were scrolls, rolled papyri, filled with incantations, their ink still dark, their words sharp as the day they were written. But beyond these treasures, beyond the familiar ritual objects, some chambers held things stranger still. Artifacts that did not appear in official texts, whose forms puzzled even the priests who carried them into the dark. Spheres of polished stone etched with lines like star maps, their patterns not matching any known sky. Figurines of beings with faces neither human nor animal, their features elongated, their limbs too thin. In one chamber, legend said, lay a slab carved with symbols no priest could read, signs older than the hieroglyphs, older perhaps than Egypt itself. These objects were not displayed with the grandeur of gold, but tucked into corners, half hidden, as if meant for the pharaoh's eyes alone. It was whispered among certain priestly orders that these hidden artifacts were gifts, or perhaps warnings from the desert itself, that deep beneath the sands lay truths about the earth and the stars, truths too heavy for common ears. The pharaoh, as the bridge between man and God, was entrusted with them, buried with them, to guard their meaning for eternity. Some said the pyramids themselves were not merely tombs, but containers, designed to hold these secrets, to prevent them from ever escaping into the world. The pharaoh's body was the key, the chamber, the lock, the pyramid, the seal. And yet, even with such care, fear lingered. Priests who entered the chamber during burial rites sometimes emerged pale, trembling, their voices hushed for days. They spoke of hearing sounds within the chamber when all had fallen silent, low hums that vibrated in their bones, whispers that seemed to rise from the sarcophagus itself. Some claimed that when the torches flickered low, the stars on the ceiling shifted faintly, their alignment changing as though the heavens themselves were alive within the stone. None dared to speak of this openly, for to question the nature of the chamber was to question the divine itself. When the rites were completed, the chamber was sealed forever. Massive blocks slid into place, corridors filled with rubble, entrances erased. Priests walked backward as they withdrew, chanting prayers to close the veil behind them, their eyes lowered to avoid glimpsing what should not be remembered. Outside, beneath the open sky, the people saw only the grandeur of the pyramid rising, never knowing the secret world entombed within. For them, the king's tomb was a monument of power. For the initiated, it was a sanctuary of silence, a container for mysteries too vast for the living. Centuries passed, dynasties rose and fell, yet the hidden chambers endured, untouched beneath the sand. Robbers found false passages, hollow tombs filled with traps, but the true sanctuaries remained inviolate, their treasures and their secrets untouched. And though storms and time wore away the surface of the pyramids, their hearts remained intact, heavy with silence, heavy with meaning. To this day, beneath the desert's shifting skin, those chambers wait, their walls still glimmering with stars, their sarcophagi still heavy with kings who dreamed of eternity. The pyramids may rise above the earth, their grandeur visible to all, but their deepest essence lies hidden. In chambers where no sunlight falls, where silence reigns eternal, the pharaohs sleep among maps of stars and artifacts of forgotten origin. And there, in the dark, the veil between worlds remains thin, guarded by stone, guarded by secrecy, guarded by the eternal hush of the desert. The desert is not empty. Beneath its vast silence, beneath its shifting waves of sand, there are patterns and presences older than the pyramids themselves. Among the most enduring of Egypt's hidden beliefs was the serpent, a creature both feared and revered, both destroyer and protector, whose coils were said to wind not only through the dunes but through the very fabric of creation. To most, serpents were pests of the fields, their sudden strike a reminder of mortality, but to those initiated into deeper mysteries, the serpent was more than an animal. It was a messenger, a keeper of secrets, a symbol of eternity itself. Legends told of cults who worshipped these creatures in silence, gathering not in grand temples but in caves and tunnels carved beneath the desert. Their gatherings were small, their chants low, their offerings hidden from the eyes of kings and priests. They believed the serpent carried the voice of the earth, that its hiss was not mere sound but language, whispers of truths buried in stone and sand. These devotees painted serpentine figures upon the walls of their hidden sanctuaries, their bodies winding in endless loops, their eyes wide, unblinking. To them, the serpent was not enemy to man but the very embodiment of what lay beyond sight. Unseen currents of time, invisible rivers of memory, the eternal cycle of death and rebirth. The most feared of these serpent beings was Apep, the great coiling chaos that dwelt in the underworld, enemy of Ra, forever rising to swallow the sun during its nightly passage. Each dawn was a victory of light over this devouring shadow, each sunrise proof that Apep had been defeated once more. Yet, even as priests of Ra cursed Apep, striking its image with knives and burning its effigies in fire, other whispers lingered, that some saw in the serpent not merely chaos but power, a force necessary to balance the order of the gods. To worship such a being was forbidden, yet the desert kept its secrets well, and deep beneath the sands, carvings told of men and women who knelt not before Ra's brilliance but before the coiled shadow of Apep, listening for wisdom hidden in its hiss. Not all serpent cults served chaos. Some believed in the serpent as guardian, protector of tombs and chambers. They told of Mehen, the great serpent who wrapped itself around Ra's bark as it sailed through the night sky, shielding him from the attacks of Apep. Images of Mehen appeared in secret carvings, winding coils surrounding the pharaoh, offering protection in the perilous journey through the underworld. Those who followed this serpent cult carved its form into amulets of stone and gold, small enough to fit in the palm, worn upon the chest as protection against unseen dangers. When buried in tombs, such amulets were believed to come alive in the afterlife, wrapping their coils around the soul, keeping it safe as it passed through trials and terrors. Archaeologists in later centuries, stumbling upon narrow tunnels beneath collapsed temples, found walls alive with these carvings. Serpents looped endlessly, their bodies intersecting, forming patterns like woven fabric. Between them appeared symbols that baffled even seasoned scholars: eyes within spirals, stars within coils, figures of men with serpentine heads. These were not the official hieroglyphs of temple walls, but a language older, stranger, preserved only in shadowed spaces where light seldom reached. To study them too long was to feel a subtle unease, as though the signs themselves writhed upon the stone, shifting when unseen, hissing when silence deepened. The common folk, too, feared the serpents of the desert, telling stories of creatures that slithered unseen through dunes, large enough to swallow a man whole. Bedouin herders spoke of nights when the sand seemed to ripple like water, as though something vast moved beneath. Children were warned not to stray too far, lest the sand itself open to reveal the gleaming eyes of a serpent older than memory. And yet, even in their fear, they carved serpent charms, traced serpent forms upon their doors, whispered serpent prayers to protect against drought and plague. Fear and reverence were bound tightly together, impossible to separate. In the rituals of certain secretive sects, serpents were brought alive into the chambers of the dead. Priests carried them in woven baskets, releasing them to coil around statues, to slither across offerings of bread and wine. It was believed that their presence awakened the tomb, stirring the soul of the pharaoh, carrying messages between the living and the departed. To watch a serpent glide silently across the stone was to witness eternity itself, a cycle without beginning or end. Its movement mirrored the river, the stars, the eternal return of the Sunday. Its venom, both deadly and healing, was a reminder that life and death were never far apart. Stories endured of priests bitten during such rites, collapsing to the floor, their bodies trembling as venom coursed through them. Yet sometimes, rather than dying, they rose again hours later, their eyes distant, their voices changed, as though touched by another presence. Such men were revered as prophets, their words sought eagerly, though often their speech came as riddles, layered with meanings none could fully untangle. Some said the serpent had spoken through them, lending its voice to human tongue. Others whispered that their souls had left their bodies entirely, replaced by something older, something that lingered long after the venom faded. In time, the cults of the serpent faded from open practice, their rites absorbed or erased by the dominance of Ra, Osiris, and the great temples of the state. But beneath the sands, in forgotten tunnels, their carvings still breathe. Travelers lost in the desert sometimes stumble upon strange stones carved with coiled forms, their surfaces cool despite the burning heat. They speak of dreams that follow after dreams, of endless tunnels, of hissing voices, of eyes watching from the dark. Whether these are warnings or invitations remains unknown. And so the serpents endure, not only in the dunes but in the very memory of Egypt. They are chaos and protection, fear and reverence, silence and whisper. To see one glide across the sand at dusk is to glimpse more than an animal. It is to glimpse a fragment of eternity, a messenger from the depths. The pyramids may rise immovable above, but beneath them coils the serpent, winding silently through stone and shadow, carrying with it secrets the desert has never spoken aloud. Above the desert stretched a sky so vast that even the pyramids seemed small beneath it. Night after night, it unfurled in silence, a tapestry of stars scattered across the black dome of heaven. To most who gazed upward, the stars were a wonder, distant lights that guided travelers and marked the rhythm of the seasons. But to Egypt's priestly astronomers, they were far more, living signs, divine beings whose paths dictated not only the cycle of crops and floods, but the very destiny of kings and kingdoms. These men and women, cloaked in linen and crowned with circlets of reeds, were the eternal astronomers, their eyes fixed on the heavens, their minds stretched across eternity. It was no coincidence that the pyramids stood as they did, their angles aligned with the cardinal directions, their shafts pointing toward certain stars. The builders were not only masons but mathematicians of the sky, translating celestial order into stone. The Great Pyramid, it was said, was aligned to Orion's belt, the constellation the Egyptians called Sa, sacred to Osiris, lord of the dead and master of rebirth. To lie within its chambers was to join Osiris in the heavens, to rise among the stars at the end of mortal life. Thus the pyramid was not merely a tomb, but a ladder, a cosmic engine, a stone horizon that connected Earth to the eternal sky. The eternal astronomers gathered on clear nights upon temple roofs or high desert plateaus, their gaze never wavering from the stars above. They carried simple tools, plumb lines, palm wood sighting rods, water clocks, to measure the passage of hours. But through patience and devotion, they mapped the heavens with a precision that echoed across millennia. They marked the rising of Sirius, the brilliant star whose first appearance each year heralded the inundation of the Nile. They charted the slow wandering of planets, the fixed patterns of constellations, the shifting of the sun across the horizon. In their hands, the heavens became both clock and scripture, revealing rhythms that shaped the destiny of men. But their work was not simply practical. To them, astronomy was theology written in light. The stars were not cold points of fire but the souls of the departed, kings and queens transformed into eternal guardians. The Milky Way was not a scattering of dust but a celestial river, twin to the Nile, carrying souls through the heavens. The sun was Ra's bark, the moon the eye of Horus, the stars the retinue of Osiris. To read the heavens was to read the will of the gods, to understand creation itself as a vast, unfolding hymn. Each alignment of stone to star, each measurement of light and shadow, was a prayer carved into the language of the cosmos. In the innermost sanctuaries of temples, records of these observations were kept scrolls of papyrus, filled with symbols of constellations, lists of rising and setting stars, calendars of festivals tied to celestial events. But not all was written. Some knowledge was passed only in whispers, guarded by the initiated, hidden even from kings. These secrets told of cycles longer than dynasties, patterns that stretched across centuries. The astronomers believed that just as the Nile rose and fell in seasons, so too did the heavens move in greater rhythms, marking ages of prosperity and decline. To those who understood these patterns, history itself was not chaos, but order, written in light across the sky. There were rituals, too, tied to these celestial cycles. At certain hours of the night, when particular stars rose above the horizon, priests ascended the temple roofs and sang hymns, their voices rising like smoke toward the constellations. They burned incense of myrrh and frankincense, their fragrance drifting upward as offerings to the sky. Sometimes they drew circles in the sand, tracing the movements of stars with careful fingers, teaching apprentices how the heavens mirrored the earth. And at rare moments, when stars aligned in ways that came but once in lifetimes, grand ceremonies were held. Kings themselves stood beside the astronomers, lifting their arms to the heavens, proclaiming themselves not only rulers of earth, but children of the stars. The most profound of these moments came with the heliacal rising of Sirius, the morning when the star first appeared in the dawn sky. For the people, it marked the coming flood, the renewal of the land. For the astronomers, it was the rebirth of the cosmos, a reminder that life and death were woven together in cycles without end. On that morning, as the first light of Sirius pierced the horizon, priests and kings together stood in reverence. Torches were extinguished, for the star itself was flame enough. Silence filled the desert, broken only by the slow rising chant of the astronomers, their words lifting with the star itself. In that moment, heaven and earth were one. Yet, as with all of Egypt's secrets, there were deeper layers. Some astronomers spoke in hushed tones of stars that were not fixed, of shadows that moved across the heavens in ways not written in the public texts. They whispered of alignments that foretold calamity, of dark stars unseen by most eyes, of constellations erased from memory. A few dared to record these things in hidden chambers, carving them into stone where only the initiated would find them. To read such records was to confront the unsettling truth that the cosmos, like the desert, held not only light but shadow, not only order but mystery. Even after centuries, when dynasties fell and temples crumbled, the work of the eternal astronomers endured. Farmers still watched Sirius to guide their planting, sailors still steered by Orion, priests still aligned their prayers to the rising Sunday. And though much of their secret lore was lost to sand and time, fragments remained: star maps carved upon ceilings, constellations painted upon tomb walls, papyri scattered in ruins. In their patient devotion, they had written eternity upon both stone and sky, leaving behind a legacy that could not be erased. Tonight, as the desert lies in silence and the pyramids rise against the stars, the work of the eternal astronomers continues. For the heavens have not ceased their song, nor have the stars forgotten their paths. Each light above is a reminder, each constellation a story, each alignment a whisper of order in the vastness of night. And those who listen closely, who let their eyes linger upon the sky, may yet hear the echoes of those ancient priests, their chants woven into the fabric of the cosmos, their patience eternal as the stars themselves. When the body of a king or noble was laid to rest, the final veil between his mortal self and eternity was not the stone of the tomb, nor the sarcophagus carved from granite, but the mask placed upon his face. These masks, hammered from gold or inlaid with stones, were not mere decoration. They were talismans, sacred instruments fashioned to preserve identity, to guard the spirit, and to speak silently to the gods in languages beyond the reach of human tongues. In the dim light of burial chambers, when torches flickered and incense smoke curled like spirits of air, these masks shone with a brilliance that defied darkness, reflecting not only light but the eternity they were meant to embody. The Egyptians believed that death was not an ending but a passage, and that in the perilous journey through the underworld, the soul required protection at every step. The mask was the final defense, the most intimate shield. Fashioned to resemble the face of the departed yet perfected into divine form, it ensured that the spirit would be recognized by the gods and welcomed among them. Without it, the dead might wander unseen, forgotten, their names erased, their souls swallowed by silence. With it, they became eternal, bound to the stars, their features unchanging as the gold that covered them. The most famous of these is known to us as the Mask of Tutankhamun, its surface of gold inlaid with lapis, carnelian, and turquoise, its eyes deep and watchful. But his was not the only mask, nor even the first. Across dynasties, countless faces of kings, queens, and priests were fashioned from precious metals, their expressions serene, their gazes fixed upon eternity. Each bore inscriptions along its shoulders and brow, spells drawn from the Book of the Dead, invocations of protection, names of gods, symbols of power. These were not merely for show, but living words, bound into the very fabric of the mask, so that each time the sun's light touched the gold, the words themselves awoke anew. Gold was chosen not only for its beauty but for its permanence. Unlike other metals, it did not tarnish, did not decay, did not surrender to the corruption of time. To cover the face of the dead with gold was to declare that their spirit, too, would remain incorruptible, eternal as the Sunday. But the masks carried more than this promise. Within their hammered surfaces lay a secret geometry, patterns of lines and proportions that echoed the stars above, and the sacred measurements of the pyramids themselves. Each angle was calculated, each curve aligned, so that the mask became more than an object. It became a map, a mirror of the cosmos pressed against the face of the departed. There were whispers among the artisans, those chosen few who hammered and shaped these sacred objects, that the making of a mask was itself a ritual. They worked not only with metal but with chants, with offerings, with silence. Before they began, they fasted, purifying themselves in the waters of the Nile. They invoked Ptah, Lord of Craftsmen, asking that their hands be guided not by skill alone but by divinity. And as they hammered gold sheet upon wooden mold, as they polished stone for the eyes, they whispered words not meant for any listener but the mask itself, for they believed that in the making, the mask already began to breathe, already began to see, already began to wait for the face it would one day cover. Some masks bore subtle differences that spoke to hidden truths. The lips were sometimes curved faintly upward, as though to reassure the dead with a final smile. Others were solemn, stern, their brows furrowed in eternal vigilance. Still others carried strange symbols upon their foreheads, serpents, vultures, or stars, each chosen not at random but according to secret rites. The serpent, symbol of Wadjet, marked protection and power. The vulture, Nekbet, denoted divine motherhood. The star aligned the soul with the endless heavens. In these small details lay whole libraries of meaning, messages carried not in words but in form, awaiting the gaze of gods rather than men. But among the countless masks crafted across centuries, a few carried deeper mysteries. There were stories of masks that did not reflect the human face beneath them at all, but instead bore features strange and unsettling: elongated eyes, angular jaws, expressions more divine than human. These were said to be for pharaohs, who claimed descent not only from gods but from forces older, forces whose names had already faded from memory. The artisans who crafted them swore secrecy, their mouths bound by oaths and threat, and though these masks were placed within tombs as any other, some whispered that they were never meant to be seen again, for to look upon them was to glimpse truths not meant for mortal eyes. In the funerary rituals, the moment the mask was placed upon the face of the dead was the climax of the ceremony. Priests lifted it slowly, their hands steady, their chants rising, until it rested over the linen-wrapped visage beneath. Then silence fell, for in that instant it was believed that the soul felt the mask, recognized its own likeness, and was bound to it forever. The mask became its anchor, its vessel, its eternal companion, and as the sarcophagus was sealed, as the chamber was closed, The mask gleamed one last time in the torchlight before vanishing into darkness, carrying the face of the departed into eternity. Centuries later, when tombs were broken open and masks uncovered, their power had not faded. Those who gazed upon them felt awe, felt fear, felt as though the golden eyes still watched, still remembered, still whispered silently in a language too old for ears. For the Egyptians had bound more than metal into these objects. They had bound belief, ritual, and eternity itself. To hold such a mask was to hold a fragment of a world where death was not the end, where gold was more than wealth, where silence itself was alive. And so the masks endure, scattered now across museums and hidden chambers, their faces gleaming still beneath artificial light. Yet even stripped from their tombs, they carry whispers of the desert night, of the chants of priests, of the eternal gaze of gods. To look into their eyes is to feel oneself measured, weighed against eternity, reminded that behind every mortal face lies the promise of transformation. For in the golden masks of Egypt, the dead did not merely rest, they lived, eternal, carried by the weight of metal, by the language of symbols, by the silence of the afterlife. When the sun slipped beneath the horizon, and the last light bled away from the limestone cliffs, the desert began to sing, not with instruments, not with voices raised in triumph, but with something softer, a music woven into the breath of wind and the hush of shifting sand. It was said that Egypt's workers, priests, and wanderers once carried songs into the desert night, songs that were never written upon papyrus or carved into stone, yet lingered still, faint as starlight. These were the secret hymns, not recorded in the scrolls of scribes, nor proclaimed in the festivals of temples, but preserved by the air itself, an invisible choir of the forgotten. Their lullabies carried endlessly across the dunes. The songs began with the builders, men whose hands bled upon the stones of pyramids and temples, whose sweat soaked the desert floor. At night, when their labors ceased and fires flickered faintly in the camp, they sang. Their voices were low, rough from dust and toil, yet filled with a yearning that reached beyond hardship. They sang of the river that fed their families, of the harvests they prayed would not fail, of the children whose laughter echoed in distant villages. But woven into their songs were deeper notes, prayers whispered almost unconsciously to the desert itself. "Remember us," the songs seemed to say. "Do not let our names vanish into silence." And the desert, patient and vast, remembered. Priests too added their voices, though theirs were different, measured, deliberate, bound to ritual. In the stillness of midnight, they chanted invocations in hidden chambers, words meant not for human ears but for gods and spirits. Their voices rose and fell like waves, echoing against stone, until the walls themselves seemed to join in. When they emerged, the night air carried the remnants of those chants, faint threads of sound woven into the fabric of silence. The people sleeping nearby may not have understood, but they stirred in their dreams, sensing the hymns like distant thunder, like lullabies carried upon the breath of unseen worlds. Travelers and shepherds, wandering with flocks beneath the stars, contributed their own verses. Alone in the dunes, they sang to stave off fear, to keep the loneliness at bay. Their songs told of longing, of love left behind, of stars that guided them across endless emptiness. And though no audience heard, the desert did. It kept their songs as faithfully as it kept the secrets of kings. In the stillness of night, when winds stirred faintly, the echoes of those solitary voices lingered, faint but enduring, threads in the eternal hymn of the sands. Even children played their part. In villages pressed against the desert's edge, they sang games in twilight, their laughter rising in shrill cadences that seemed almost to mimic the songs of birds. They traced shapes in the sand with their feet, chanting names of gods they barely understood, imagining pyramids and temples in their games. Their songs, though small, were not lost, for the desert cared little for grandeur. It remembered all with equal patience. The voice of a child was as eternal as the chant of a priest, the cry of a mother as enduring as the hymn of a king. Over time, these songs merged into something greater, an invisible choir that no single generation could hear in its fullness. Storms carried fragments across centuries, blending prayers with laments, chants with laughter, whispers with silence. At times, travelers swore they heard them clearly, a hum in the dunes, a melody without source, as though the sand itself vibrated with memory. Some dismissed it as wind, others as trickery of exhaustion. But those who listened with reverence, who closed their eyes and let the desert speak, felt something deeper, the weight of countless voices layered together, singing not of glory or conquest, but of existence itself. There were nights when the hymns seemed strongest, when the stars hung low and the moon cast silver across the dunes. On such nights, priests claimed the boundary between the worlds grew thin, and the voices of the dead joined those of the living. Entire caravans halted their journey, their camels kneeling in silence, as the air around them hummed faintly, as if with unseen choirs. No one spoke, for to interrupt was to break the fragile thread of communion. Instead, they listened, letting the sound seep into their bones, carrying it forward even after it faded. The desert's secret hymns were not always gentle. In times of famine, when the Nile failed and fields withered, the songs turned heavy, filled with sorrow. Mothers keened into the night, their voices breaking, their laments swallowed by the wind yet carried far across the sands. Soldiers sang dirges for fallen comrades, their voices rough, their words bitter. Priests sang pleas for mercy, begging the gods to restore balance, to return abundance. The desert remembered these songs too, holding grief alongside joy, sorrow alongside love. Its hymn was not harmony alone, but the full measure of human experience, bound together into something eternal. Even now, when the desert stretches vast and silent, the attentive ear might catch traces of these hymns. At twilight, the wind sometimes shifts, carrying a sound that is not quite music, but not mere noise either, a hum, a murmur, a cadence. To the weary traveler, it may feel like comfort, a reminder that one is not alone. To the dreamer beneath the stars, it may feel like invitation, a promise that their own voice too will be remembered when it is gone. For the desert forgets nothing. It takes each note, each breath, and binds it into silence, transforming it into music that only eternity can hear. And so Egypt's greatest hymn was never written in stone, never recorded in ink. It was sung by countless voices, each small, each fleeting, yet together forming a chorus that still lingers upon the breath of the desert. The pyramids may guard kings, the temples may proclaim the names of gods, but the dunes carry the songs of the people, soft, secret, eternal. Listen closely, and you may still hear them, drifting just beyond the edge of silence. The desert's hymn, a song of memory, a song of life, a song that never ends. Not all of Egypt's secrets rest in tombs of kings or shrines of gods. Some lie hidden in the very sand, entire cities erased from memory, their streets buried, their voices hushed, their names lost even to the most faithful scribes. Such was the fate of a city once alive with laughter, trade, and prayer, now swallowed whole by the shifting desert. No stone marked its gates, no temple stood to proclaim its name, and yet the whispers of its presence lingered, faint as a shadow at dusk. For though the desert erased its walls, it did not erase its memory. The vanished city lived still, beneath dunes that rose like waves of a silent sea. It was said that this city flourished during an age of prosperity, when the Nile's floods were abundant, and caravans carried goods from distant lands. Its streets were narrow, paved with limestone blocks, smoothed by countless footsteps. Mud brick houses leaned into one another, their walls painted with ochre and whitewash, their doorways shaded with woven mats. In the heart of the city stood a marketplace where merchants cried their wares. Jars of honey, bolts of linen, beads of turquoise, dried figs sweet as sunlight. Children darted between stalls, their laughter mingling with the bleating of goats and the clatter of pots. Life here pulsed with energy, ordinary yet eternal. Temples too rose within its bounds, though none so grand as the pyramids or Karnak. Their courtyards were shaded by stone columns painted with lotus and papyrus, their sanctuaries alive with incense. Priests tended shrines where statues of familiar gods sat draped in garlands, their golden eyes watching silently as offerings of bread, beer, and flowers were laid at their feet. Festivals brought the streets alive with music systems rattling, drums pounding, voices raised in hymns that echoed against the desert hills. At night, oil lamps glowed in every doorway, casting warm circles of light as families gathered to share meals and stories. Yet beneath this ordinary rhythm of life, whispers of secrecy lingered. The city, some said, had been chosen by a forgotten goddess, a spirit of shadow and memory, whose temple was hidden in the dunes nearby. Her followers moved quietly through the streets, carrying small offerings in the folds of their garments, their prayers never spoken aloud. To the outside world, the city was no different from any other, but those who lived within felt the presence of something deeper, an unseen watchfulness, a silence beneath their joy. No one could say when the city began to fade. Some claimed it was the work of the gods, a punishment for secrets held too tightly. Others blamed the Nile, whose floods one year failed, then failed again, until fields withered and famine spread. Caravans ceased to come, trade dwindled, hunger gnawed at the people. Still others whispered of storms, fierce winds that rose from the west, carrying walls of sand that buried fields and homes alike. Whatever the cause, the city was abandoned, its streets left to silence, its shrines to crumble, its marketplace to vanish beneath drifts of golden dust. Families fled to villages along the river, carrying what little they could, leaving behind only walls too heavy to move and memories too fragile to endure. Over the centuries, the desert claimed it fully. Dunes rose higher, shifting with each storm, layering over the houses, the market, the temples. Roofs collapsed, courtyards filled, streets disappeared. From afar, no trace remained. The city became a story, a half-remembered tale told by travelers. There was once a place here, where the sands now lie unbroken. Scribes recorded nothing, for the city had not belonged to kings. Its name faded, its gods forgotten, its people lost. Only the desert remembered. And yet, sometimes, fragments surfaced. A potsherd painted with bright lotus flowers, uncovered by a storm, a fragment of a wall, carved with faint hieroglyphs, revealed by shifting dunes before vanishing again. Shepherds spoke of stumbling upon doorways half-buried, their lintels still intact, leading downward into darkness. Caravans told of hearing strange sounds at night near the dunes, echoes of laughter, the faint ring of a sistrum, the cry of a child. Some dismissed these as tricks of wind and exhaustion, but others swore the city still lived beneath the sand, its spirit refusing to fade. In later centuries, explorers dug at the dunes, seeking the lost city. They found skeletons of walls, shards of pottery, fragments of tools. They found rooms still filled with the dust of daily life, grinding stones, broken jars, baskets of reed. In one chamber they discovered painted scenes of festivals, men and women dancing, their arms raised in joy. Yet the paint was faded, the figures ghost-like, as if already half erased. In another they found an altar, its surface darkened by fire, though no statue remained. The goddess who had watched here was gone, or perhaps she lingered still, veiled by silence. Even today, the dunes shift restlessly over the plateau, revealing glimpses before swallowing them again. Travelers crossing the desert sometimes feel the uncanny sense of being watched, though no figure stands nearby. Their camels balk, refusing to move forward, as if sensing foundations beneath the sand. Streets hidden, walls unseen. Those who sleep near the site speak of dreams filled with noise, crowded marketplaces, songs drifting on the air, bells ringing faintly. They wake to silence. The desert stretched endless. The city vanished once more. The vanished city is not unique. The desert has swallowed countless places, yet this one lingers more strongly, perhaps because its memory was bound to song. The hymns of its people, the chants of its priests, the laughter of its children, all were carried into the sand, folded into the desert's eternal chorus. To walk near its buried heart is to feel those echoes stir, to sense the life that once was, waiting just beneath the surface. The pyramids may rise eternal, their stones visible against the sky, but the desert reminds us that not all that is sacred endures in stone. Some lives, some cities, are remembered only in whispers, in fragments, in silence. And though the vanished city lies buried, it is not gone. For in the desert, nothing is ever truly lost. Every hymn, every footstep, every cry is carried still, hidden beneath the dunes, waiting for ears patient enough to listen. Long before the stones of Giza were stacked into mountains, before pharaohs carved their names into eternity, there was said to be a covenant, an agreement sealed not in ink or papyrus, but in blood and silence, between the first kings of Egypt and the gods who granted them power. It was not a pact celebrated in temples or written in official hymns, but one spoken in shadows, whispered in hidden sanctuaries, carried forward in rituals few dared to name aloud. This covenant was older than dynasties, older than pyramids, perhaps older even than the Nile's eternal flood, and though its words have been forgotten by history, its weight lingers still, heavy as the desert itself. The story begins in an age when Egypt was not yet whole, when the land was divided into scattered tribes, each worshipping its own gods, each bound to its own patch of fertile ground. Kings rose and fell swiftly, their power fragile, their reigns fleeting. Amid this chaos, a ruler came, who sought not only to unite the land, but to bind it to eternity. His name is lost, erased by the sands, yet fragments of his presence endure in whispers and carvings too obscure for the eyes of common men. It was he who sought the covenant, travelling deep into the desert where no river flowed, carrying offerings not of wealth but of silence. There, in the hollow of a cave long since buried, the king stood before figures unseen, forces not depicted in temples, not celebrated in festivals. The desert itself was their voice, the shifting wind their breath, the silence their presence. To them he offered his blood, spilled upon stone, mixed with water from the Nile carried in clay jars. He promised that his line would guard their secrets, that temples would rise to honor the gods of light, but beneath them, rites would be performed in silence to honor the unseen. In return, they promised stability, abundance, the order of Ma'at preserved through generations. It was, in truth, a pact not of devotion but of necessity, an exchange between human ambition and divine patience. For centuries afterward, this covenant was renewed in hidden chambers beneath temples and pyramids. Kings, at the height of their coronation, were led away from the crowds, away from the golden crowns and public chants, into silence. There, with only a handful of priests as witness, they cut their palms upon stone and whispered the vow, to honor the gods of Egypt openly, and to honor the gods of silence secretly. The blood was mingled with wine, poured into channels carved into the floor, where it disappeared into the earth. The covenant was thus sustained, invisible yet binding, a hidden foundation beneath the grandeur of Egypt's civilization. Few knew of these rituals. Priests who participated were bound by oaths more severe than death. Scribes who recorded fragments did so, in symbols no common eye could read, their scrolls buried in niches behind walls or locked within stone boxes. Yet fragments survived. A hymn scratched upon a pottery shard speaks of the watchers beneath the sand. A carving half erased shows a king kneeling before figures without faces. A tomb painting, overlooked, depicts a line of priests pouring red liquid into cracks of stone, while their mouths are closed in silence. These are faint traces, but together they form a pattern, echoes of a covenant that could not be entirely erased. The covenant, however, carried with it a price, for in exchange for stability there were sacrifices, not of armies or wealth, but of memory. Names were erased, deeds forgotten, entire cities left to vanish beneath the dunes. Each erasure was a gift to the gods of silence, a way of feeding them without blood. The people did not understand why certain records vanished, why kings who had ruled with strength were absent from the chronicles, why temples disappeared without trace. They whispered of curses, of divine punishment, but in truth it was the covenant at work. To keep balance, to preserve prosperity, memory itself was sometimes the offering. There were priests who questioned this pact, who wondered if Egypt's greatness was built not upon divine favor, but upon silence demanded in exchange. They feared that the covenant had given too much, that in trading memory for stability, Egypt had bound itself to forces it could never truly control. But their doubts were never written openly, never spoken above whispers, for to question the covenant was to risk being erased as well, their names struck from stone, their voices absorbed into the desert hymn. And so, silence reigned, even among the doubters. With time, the covenant itself faded from human recall, though its shadow lingered. Kings who reigned long and prosperously were remembered as chosen of the gods, their greatness celebrated in temples. Yet behind their triumphs lay an unspoken truth. They had renewed the covenant. They had whispered their blood oaths in secret chambers. They had promised silence to forces unseen. When dynasties crumbled, when famine struck, when chaos returned, some whispered that the covenant had been broken, that the vow was forgotten, and with each collapse, priests scrambled in panic to renew the pact, to whisper again into the desert, to pour offerings into cracks of stone. Even today, the pyramids stand as monuments not only to kings, but to this forgotten covenant. Their stones gleam in sunlight, their corridors echo with silence, their chambers conceal artifacts not meant for human eyes. Travelers who sit beneath their shadow at dusk sometimes feel a heaviness, as though unseen witnesses linger nearby, waiting for words never spoken. The desert itself seems to listen, its sands shifting softly, as though remembering vows whispered thousands of years ago. The covenant is no longer remembered in rituals, no longer whispered in coronations, no longer bound in blood, and yet it endures. For every erased name, every vanished city, every silence preserved in stone is a reminder of its presence. Egypt may have forgotten the words, but the desert has not, the pyramids have not, the silence itself has not. The covenant remains, eternal, hidden, binding still, waiting for those who dare to listen. And so, after drifting through whispers of sand, rivers of life, the hidden language of stone, forgotten goddesses, guardians, rites, chambers, serpents, stars, masks, hymns, vanished cities, and covenants sealed in silence, the story comes full circle, back to where it began. The pyramids rising immovable upon the horizon, their sharp edges softened by centuries of wind and light. They stand as they always have, dark against the pale sweep of desert, eternal as the sky itself. Yet now, after wandering through Egypt's hidden heart, one sees them differently, not as monuments of stone alone, but as vessels brimming with memory, humming with secrets too vast for words. At dusk, when the sun dips low and paints the limestone in hues of fire, the pyramids appear almost alive, as though the desert itself exhales through their stones. Shadows stretch across the plateau, long and patient, echoing the passage of centuries. The air grows still, heavy with silence, and it is in that silence that the whispers return. They are not loud, not insistent, but soft, like lullabies carried upon wind. The desert speaks again, not in words but in presence, reminding all who listen that nothing is ever lost, that every prayer, every chant, every secret remains woven into the breath of the land. To the traveller who stands before them, the pyramids seem to watch. Their sharp peaks pierce the sky, their bases sink deep into the earth, bridging heaven and soil, gods and men, eternity and fleeting breath. They are thresholds, points where the visible and the unseen touch. One feels both small and infinite beneath them, as though one's heartbeat joins the rhythm of eternity. And if the traveller closes their eyes, they may feel the weight of the centuries pressing gently upon them, the workers' songs, the priest's chants, the serpent's hiss, the astronomer's calculations, the mask's eternal gaze, the vanished city's laughter, the covenant's vow, all of it layered together, resonating in the silence. Night comes, as it always does. The last glow fades from the stones, stars pierce the dark, and the pyramids retreat into shadow. Yet they do not disappear. Their mass is felt more than seen, their presence more than shape. The great Sphinx crouches nearby, its face eroded yet unyielding, its eyes fixed upon horizons unseen. Around them, the desert stretches endless, its dunes shifting softly, carrying the secret hymns of countless generations. The Nile flows not far away, its waters dark beneath the moon, a ribbon of eternity, winding silently through the land. It is here, in this stillness, that one understands Egypt's truest gift. Not the monuments themselves, not the gold buried within, but the silence that surrounds them. It is a silence alive with memory, a silence that listens, that gathers every voice, every offering, every forgotten covenant. It does not judge, it does not answer, it simply endures, patient as stone, vast as the stars. To rest in this silence is to feel the weight of eternity, not as burden, but as lullaby, gentle and steady, guiding one toward dreams. The pyramids do not speak, yet they carry the voices of the past. The desert does not sing, yet it holds a hymn older than memory. Egypt's secrets are not lost, they are only hidden, folded into silence, waiting for those who walk slowly, who listen carefully, who allow themselves to drift into its rhythm. For here, beneath the silent pyramids, the veil of time grows thin, and one feels eternity brushing softly against the skin, as gentle as desert wind, as endless as the stars. And so the story ends where it began, in whispers beneath the sand, in shadows cast by pyramids, in hymns carried by the desert's breath. The guardians keep their silence, the chambers keep their secrets, the stars keep their watch. And you, standing beneath it all, feel yourself drift gently into that same silence, carried upon the lullaby of eternity, until the desert itself seems to cradle you, whispering softly, "Nothing is lost, everything endures."